欢迎回到UDN.com 的直播现场。我们现在在新闻年会的场地，今天是第二天的会议。在这个今天的讨论里面，其实新闻议价一直是一个大家非常感兴趣的重点。今天在我们现场的是新闻集团的副总裁米勒先生，他是一手推动澳洲跟Google 这些平台达成协议的一个主要的推手。我们今天来请他来跟他分享他在澳洲推动这个事情的经验。Thank you, Mr. Miller, for taking the interview with us. First of all, I think media bargaining is something everyone is very interested in this conference. What makes Australia so successful, become the first country legislating regarding these issues?
The Australian approach has been very different to the European approach. The European approach was predominantly around copyright and the use of media's snippets and extracts on social media posts, also on news aggregators. And it's very hard to argue copyright because using snippets is actually allowed in terms of an extract. It needs to be acknowledged and credited. The Australian government in 2017 referred the matter to the Australian Competition Commission, the ACCC, whether there was a power imbalance between the tech companies and media companies.
Oh, okay.
And so they really investigated path of competition law.
Okay. So one of the distinction between Australia's approach with other countries is that Australian government is really strongly backing the news organization in asking for this news bargaining.
Yes.
Why other countries is not having that approach?
I suppose I'm not as intimately familiar with the other approaches of other companies, of other countries. But I think a foundation of most countries, though, is the importance of a free press.
Right.
And a press that can continue to cover national issues, keep the public informed, but also ensure that commentary is surfaced.
Right.
And there is no doubt that the impact that the tech platforms were having on media companies was not just structural and cyclical. It was, in the case of what the Australian Competition Commission has now determined and the Australian Parliament accepted, was competitively disadvantaging those companies, media companies, to be able to perform that role in serving the Australian citizens.
One of the things that a lot of countries is struggling is how they can all united together in order to against the media platform. I mean, in order to against those platforms like the Google or YouTube, so on and so forth. And this is some country would consider is against the antitrust, but certainly Australia didn't see it in that way.
Well, it was actually publishers and media companies. And media companies in Australia are not just news publishers, they're also the government-owned broadcasters.
Right.
So there's a variety of large and small publishers who individually submitted. There were industry bodies that were able to submit, but in Australia, again, that we are unable to negotiate together. That would be cartel behaviour. And so that individual publishers have now reached agreements with Meta and Google, Alphabet, in regards to being remunerated for our journalism.
Which one is the toughest negotiator? Meta, Google, or Apple?
They're all very different. They're taking different approaches.
Okay.
I wouldn't say any of them are easy or they're all challenging. But I suppose having now reached agreement with those companies, I think the mindset that I take is they're now partners. They're important partners to our business, and that it's important that we help give them value back for what we're now being acknowledged in terms of the payments we're receiving. So we have agreements in place, and they are commercial in confidence.
Right.
So I'm not going to go into the details of those contracts.
Right.
But in terms of the negotiations, they were spirited, but they weren't personal.
I was told that in a certain moment they are threatened to taking now all the contents from Google or from Meta and so on and so forth. Is that considered a threat? I understand they did it to like the in Canada and other countries.
There were 3 days that Facebook didn't publish in Australia.
Okay.
And there was something
didn't publish anything.
They didn't publish news and information.
Okay, right.
But that also included government information, medical information. It also included social community information. And that I think for a lot of Australians, they realised that whether it be their local kids' sporting team, whether it be their mothers' groups, whether it be important day-to-day, as I say, government information, suddenly they didn't have access to that. And that was also an eye-opener to, I suppose, not just Australian citizens, but also the Australian government, of how much that the Meta's position had in terms of there wasn't an alternative. And that was where the Australian Competition Commission again acknowledged and concluded that there was a position where, in regards to publishers, and it's important for publishers, our journalism to be discovered, but with the majority of Australians searching every day on one site,
right?
How is our journalism to be discovered if we're not on their platforms?
Right.
And that was really an eye-opener also, I think, for Meta, that they lost trust with the Australian public.
But is it also true that all the media in Australia united and condemned that kind of action? That is also unprecedented. On the same day.
I think we all condemned it. I'd use the word united loosely.
Okay.
It wasn't in a coordinated, we all got together. We all said the obvious, being that this is not consistent with Australian values. It's not a value of fairness, being good public and corporate citizens as well. And so I think we called, as did the government. And so I think it was a turning point in those discussions that, I suppose, mistreating your ultimate user and the advertisers that also support it was possibly a mistake. And it changed after 3 days, so that could be reflected.
So in the country where there's no such kind of Australian law, for instance, in the States, recently we heard that, for instance, Google had made a deal with the New York Times and offering them $100 million in order to publish their content on Google. Do you think that is also an alternative approach for them?
I think that there are going to be particular publishers, and again, that's a question for Google and the New York Times.
Right.
So I'm not familiar with that, but I think that publishers offer a great deal of value to the Alphabet Group, and it's not just Google.
Right.
I think when it comes to their own Bard and generative AI products, how they integrate into trusted environments, and when we're increasingly publishing them on YouTube, and whether it be horizontal or vertical video, and those trusted brands, whether you can, their output deals, which I would see would be highly attractive to that group, and also to be able to use that the journalism and the brands of the New York Times in that regard, I'd see it as being a huge value to any platform who can come to a commercial arrangement.
So one is a more comprehensive approach, one is more individualistic approach. Do you think both approach can go, or is it one is fairer than the other?
Speaking from an Australian perspective, this wasn't about our company. It was, this was about all publishers.
Right.
It was about the importance of being recognised and remunerated for the journalism that was being used on their platforms. and had been since they originated. And a lot of businesses they built their business on the back of trusted journalism, and the publishers that had invested a lot in creating that journalism hadn't been recognised or remunerated for it. And that was that was a concern, I think, for any industry when your output is being used without attribution or compensation. And I think for all publishers to have a thriving media industry is good for our citizens. And so that is really probably the starting point where I would suggest that companies and countries should consider the importance of free press in their democracies, and that the use of their journalism by others that aren't recognising it.
In the case of Taiwan, of course, there's some pressure of having a similar approach like in Australia, having a legislation, but so far the government seemed to more favor the approach of setting up a foundation and entrusting the foundation to negotiate with all the platforms. And after they receive the proceeds, and then they try to manage a way to distribute those kind of income. Yep. By setting up a foundation like that, what's your thinking on that approach?
That approach wouldn't be allowed in Australia.
Okay.
So our competition law wouldn't allow it. That would be collective bargaining from competitors working together.
Right.
I don't necessarily. I think there are going to be different publishers who want to work differently with the platforms in different ways, and that's from the approach that I'm listening to and you're describing. I don't think it necessarily achieves the best outcome for the platforms or for the publishers. As our experience has been that it was really about competition law, and once that the government decided that there was behaviours and there was a power imbalance, then they introduced what they called a mandatory media bargaining code, which mandated that the media companies would then negotiate with the tech platforms, and if we're unable to then reach an agreement, then it would be a final offer arbitration process, also known as a baseball negotiation, where each company would put in their proposed value and the arbitrator would choose one.
Okay.
Not in the between, choose one. So that was really, the government didn't want to be in a position where they negotiated and they decided, but they led it to the individual publishers to strike agreements.
So during the conference, when you talk about the past experience or how you have done the media bargaining, what kind of response you are getting from different countries?
I think other countries, other companies, they definitely want to learn, but I think they also are looking. This has been a long process.
Right.
Robert Thompson, the global CEO of News Corp, first presented on this topic to the House of Lords in London in 2007. News Corp in Australia, we made our first representations to the Australian government in 2014.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't until 2017 when the government of the day first raised this as a report they wanted to investigate.
Right.
And then that was handed to the ACCC in 2019, and it finally became law in 2021.
Right. It's a long process.
It is a long process, and I hope others don't take as long, but there's no quick fix either.
Right.
And so I think to understand the laws in your country, what competition laws, I think for government to understand the material impact it's having to informing citizens, the role of the free press, and that's important to their cultures and their identity.
Right.
Then once that's what a government I think needs to acknowledge and recognise, and that both can coexist well together, but that these are more than just market forces. They're definitely coming from positions in Australia's case of very dominant positions, which our country has laws that doesn't allow markets to be dominated by one particular search engine, as is the case.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for sharing your thought with us.
Thank you. Take care.
谢谢各位收听收看，我们下次见。Okay, thank you. Great.
Sorry, I wasn't allowed to give you